Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Did you know that there are some 5.5 million acres of our national parks that are underwater? There are sunken ships and aircraft. There are remnants of industry and mining. There are coral reefs and underwater caverns. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. The Submerged Resources Center of the National Park Service is where these water resources are explored and documented. Underwater photography is crucial in the understanding of what lies beneath the surface, and images taken by the SRC staff are essential not only for mapping and documenting, but to help the parks address issues and solve problems. This week, the Traveler's Lynn Riddick sits down with Bret Seymour, the Submerged Resources Center Deputy Chief and Audiovisual Production Specialist who has spent some 30 years with the Park Service photographing the mysteries below the surface. Lynn will be back with Bret in a minute.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. You can show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. National Parks Traveler has launched the National Parks RVing Guide, the definitive guide for RVers seeking information on campgrounds in the National Park system. The guide is now available free through the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. If you're a traveler who wants to explore the National Park system, you'll want this app. The guide is packed with details for campgrounds in more than 70 national parks across the country, searchable by park, state, or region. You'll also find feeds of the traveler's content, including our latest stories and podcasts. Download the National Parks RVing Guide and start planning your next trip today.
A rusted ship propeller. Each of its nearly perfectly preserved 4 blades, which are larger than a man, lies suspended in the cold waters of Isle Royale National Park. 3 14-inch coral and barnacle-encrusted guns from the USS Arizona's No. 1 turret pointing motionless into the dark depths of the water at the Pearl Harbor National Memorial. Clumps of diseased and bleached stony coral in Dry Tortugas National Park getting picked over by a school of hopeful fish searching for sustenance in this threatened ecosystem. These are powerful images made possible by the team of archaeologists and photographers at the Submerged Resources Center. With me today is one of those team members, Bret Seymour, audiovisual production specialist and deputy chief, calling in today from dry land at his office in Lakewood, Colorado. Hi, Bret. Welcome to The Traveler.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Well, a few years ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing your boss, Dr. Dave Conlin, archaeologist and chief of the Submerged Resources Center. And it was really fascinating to learn about this unique department and how the work it does, exploring, documenting, mapping, photographing both cultural and natural resources is really an essential part of preserving the underwater treasures in our parks. So today, I did want to talk a little more specifically about the photography that is an essential component of this department. And so for those who missed my interview with Dave, Bret, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the center?
Sure. Well, again, thank you for having me. And yes, it's a very unique program in the National Park Service that we kind of pride ourselves a little bit in kind of the best kept secret, because the best kept secret of the National Park Service, in my opinion, are those things underwater. Most people associate the National Park Service with, backcountry hikes or forests, and few people realize kind of the management responsibility and the recreational opportunities that the parks afford. So if you take places like Yellowstone National Park, There's tremendous water resources, lakes, rivers, and there's actually some very interesting things underwater at Yellowstone: geothermal features, shipwrecks, dormant thermal vents, all types of things. So there's really a tremendous amount of material, a tremendous amount of recreational opportunity. And the thing about the Park Service is our mission is to preserve and protect for future generations, regardless of where those, we call them resources. It's kind of a governmental nerdy thing to say, but I mean, where those things are, where there's coral reefs are, where those shipwrecks are, it's our responsibility as the federal agency to preserve and protect those. So what our office specializes in is just that, work underwater. It could be anything from, like you mentioned, archaeologists. We have several archaeologists on staff. So locating objects underwater, mapping objects underwater, and then kind of closing the loop and interpreting them, meaning telling their story, sharing with the public, helping those people responsible in the management team to manage them. Are they deteriorating? Is there coral disease? What do the shipwrecks look like? And then that's kind of the eternal management philosophy. But the public facing thing is really outreach and education. How can we educate the public about their parks? How can we get them excited about recreational opportunities in those? And that's really where my job comes in, specifically in underwater imaging, producing documentary films and web content. So that's kind of really my specialty in terms of telling those stories in the parks to the American public.
How many folks in your center there?
Here in Lakewood, we have 7 people. It's a very small program. We always say we have a very large office because our office really spans from American Samoa to the coast of Maine on the East Coast, and then all the way from Alaska down to the Virgin Islands. So it's a massive geological area that the national parks and those with water have. But there's 7 in the office here, and then we have 1 remote employee who's our admin. So there's 8 total in the Submerged Resources Center.
And I think it's interesting to note that there are many certified divers who do work for the National Park Service, but not in your center. Can you list some of the parks that have divers on staff?
Sure. Yeah. The National Park Service diving program actually has a very storied and interesting past. We are the oldest non-governmental diving program in the nation. We run generally about 125 to 150 divers in 23 to 25 parks. And those divers have very unique and very specific missions. For instance, in our region here in the Intermountain region, where Denver is the regional office, places like Curacante and the Black Canyon have a dive team. Nobody would associate a small inland high altitude lake as having that, but that dive team exists specifically for public safety, body recovery, resource, those types of things. They're what we call a public safety diving team. If you look at the coastal parks, Channel Islands, Dry Tortugas National Park, Biscayne National Park, those marine parks, those are largely natural resources parks. So kelp forest monitoring in Channel Islands, coral ecology, those types of things. So there's also a law enforcement capacity of diving in the National Park Service and a maintenance capacity. So we kind of pride ourselves in the program of those 8,000 to 9,000 dives a year in doing pretty much whatever the National Park Service diving needs to be done underwater. In our office at the Submerged Resources Center, we're kind of like the experts of whichever call out needs to happen. So if a park has a dive team that needs a body recovery, for instance, but it's a little bit deeper or swift water or requires a little bit of a higher level of expertise, then our office often gets called, or to locate those things. But the Park Service definitely has a long tradition of diving. And really we say it's a management function, meaning there's a lot of work that gets done underwater by National Park Service divers that most people don't associate with, but there's a tremendous amount of need to keep our parks operationally for the public.
And you said that there are 8,000 to 9,000 dives a year by these
Yes.
Park Service divers?
The people who dive in the Park Service dive a lot. We have a lot of parks like in South Florida that do a lot of coral and marine biology. They'll have several hundred dives a year each. So traditionally and over the years, that number has been pretty consistent. We hover around the 8,000 number, 6,000 hours underwater. So it's a pretty robust program. And in the scientific diving community, of which we are a member, in the scientific diving community, we are the largest organizational member of the scientific diving community as a whole. So it's a fair amount of diving that gets done in the National Park Service, and our part here at the SRC is really kind of that technical expertise and both to parks that don't have programs, but also to supplement and augment the capacity that parks have in parks.
So, how do your photography assignments originate?
Well, that's a very good question. It's kind of a dual mission. We at the SRC we have two positions that are supposed to be underwater imaging. One of them is vacant right now, but it kind of splits along two lines. Some of our underwater imaging is really in support of archaeological or science projects, right? So we send a photographer to go and document things that we find underwater, shipwrecks or dock structures, or coral areas. So there's kind of a scientific documentation that goes along with the imaging. And then the other side of that is the outreach and education, the public facing. So trying to do partnerships with National Geographic or History Channel, Discovery Channel in the media world, web-based. National Park Service Traveler is a great example. Working with them on story ideas. Again, telling that story of the underwater world of the Park Service to the general public. So sometimes our assignments are they kind of trickle in terms of what the project work is. Sometimes a lot of what I've spent my career doing is really generating those things. So generating imaging projects to tell the story and approaching parks and saying, hey, you have a great story here. I think this is really of interest to the greater public. If we get a media partner, either in a web streaming content or a television or a publication, I think there's a great story there. So it's a little of a producer role in terms of balancing, a publication or media source with the parks management and kind of helping them kind of come together, and then facilitating that imaging underwater myself in terms of providing that content to those partners to tell those stories. So sometimes it comes in through need to document science work. Sometimes it comes into telling those stories about the underwater world of the Park Service.
So, I'm thinking of a piece I did, I think last summer or fall, with Dave Morano at Dry Tortugas, and
Mm-hmm.
he had discovered remnants of graves and like a hospital foundation at Fort
Yeah,
Jefferson. Were
yeah.
you summoned to look into that further?
Well, I have imaged on that. I generated a model, a 3D photogrammetric model, which is kind of a different vein. It's one of my specialties. But yes, Josh found that, located that cemetery site, and there's a grave marker there, which was a pretty interesting, unique thing. And the unique thing has kind of come along quite a bit over the course of my career, whether it's World War II airplanes in park units, cold cases of missing persons, all kinds of very unique geological in Yellowstone, some very interesting dormant geothermal vents that really shouldn't be there, but are really found nowhere else in the world. Unique fish, the desert hole pupfish, of which they're not located anywhere else in the world. So there's all these really unique, and that one in Dry Tortugas, that grave marker kind of fits in that category of kind of really interesting stories. And they're not just things underwater. They're not things that we manage or things that we're responsible for. They have a great human story behind them. So that idea of, like you mentioned, that grave marker, that tells a whole story of who was at the fort, what type of worker was there, tracing their lineage. And it really opens up a whole new area of kind of interest and public engagement, I think, about the stories behind our national parks, which I've always found fascinating.
Yeah, and you mentioned the pupfish, because I follow that story too.
Mhm.
Um, Tell us a little bit about that. I know that there is an annual count of
Yeah.
pupfish because they're threatened, and that's the only place that you can find that species. And divers go down a couple of times a year, right? And count
Yes.
fish. And
Yes.
this year, the fish had, the population had grown a little more than the
Mhm.
last count. So, what's your involvement in that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating study because the great
And we
thing
should
about,
say that this is
yeah,
Death Valley National Park,
yes,
another park
yes.
where you wouldn't expect divers to need to go to.
No, exactly. Death Valley, the last place, probably one of the last places on Earth that you would expect this amazing aquatic resource to happen. And then you kind of dig in a little bit more, and there's this unique, tiny little breed of fish that's found nowhere else in the world. It's like an incredible story inside of a credible story. But Devil's Hole in Death Valley National Park is a really fascinating, not just environmental area, but it's kind of what the Park Service does, right? So the Park Service is interested in these kind of trends and these kind of management things, like how can we preserve and protect? So this is an example of why the Park Service exists in terms of doing these long-term studies. The pupfish, the Devil's Hole pupfish, have been monitored for many, many years, and at some point, somewhere along the line said we're gonna work to preserve these. A lot of people would say, they're tiny little fish in the middle of the desert. Well, there's a lot of those tiny little fish, and this is what we do as a conservation agency. We strive to conserve. So there in Death Valley is an incredible team of actually largely volunteers on that dive program. And like you mentioned, every year they do 2 surveys a year. They do I believe it's a summer and a winter, and they have a whole series of in-water counts with scientists. It's a very systematic survey, visual survey with cross correlation and double blind studies kind of a thing. It's a fascinating thing. I've participated in it a few times, and my role in that again is to do exactly what I do in underwater imaging. Here is a park who has a dedicated staff that is doing science and doing resource management, but they want to tell that story, and they're busy counting. They're busy doing what it is they do. So where I get asked to come in is tell that story, shoot those fish. And the couple times that I've been, the one time I went, I concentrated just on wide angle, meaning, what does the stage look like? What is the cave look like? And what are the resources there? And then the second time they were very pleased with that. The second time they asked me to come back was like, we want some really close images of the fish themselves, which is a totally different mission, right? So they wanted some really tight. They really wanted to see what the fish look like in their natural habitat. And again, they're busy counting. They're not busy doing the imaging. So they asked me to come in. It's a unique environment because it's a cave overhead environment. So you have to be a cave diver. It's also unique because it's 94 degrees, I think. It's a very, very warm body of water. So it's a tremendously interesting environment.
And it's pretty narrow, right?
It's pretty narrow. You got to squeeze through a couple of places. And the other thing, it's deep. Nobody really knows how deep it is. The last person to dive deep in there was in the mid 80s, a cave explorer called Czech Exley. He went to, I think, 455 feet, and it kept going. So it's kind of unknown how deep it is. And the Park Service is just there to manage and look at these fish and say, we want to maintain these. We want to find out, because there's a tie between this particular environment and climate change, right? They see that when things happen in other areas of the world and when things happen there in Death Valley, this is kind of an indicator species of when the counts go down because of certain environmental issues and when the counts go up because of health issues. So it's really kind of a canary in a coal mine as the park sees it. And it's a really interesting story of how the Park Service has an underwater unit or part of an underwater part of a unit, I should say, Valley, that no one would expect. Yet here we are managing and trying to conserve these fish, because it's what we do. It's honestly what we do.
Well, that leads me to my next question. I wanted to see, I guess, have you walk us through the planning and preparation of a dive. I'm curious to know the process that happens after you get a request to investigate a resource, how you outline your goals, how you schedule your trip, choose the team, and schedule the dive. What kind of follow-up reporting is involved?
Right. Well, it's a great question, because people who know what I do, you're an underwater photographer. That must be amazing, and it is. I have an incredible career. I have an incredible job. But there's a lot more that goes into just, being underwater and shooting. And to your point, when projects come in, it's all about logistics. We actually have a person on staff here that is an equipment specialist and a logistics manager, because we move a tremendous amount of equipment to a tremendous amount of different areas all around the National Park Service. And if you think about it, our assignments aren't in downtown Denver or St. Louis or Los Angeles, where there's an airport. Our stuff is in remote areas. They're national parks. Sometimes they're at sea, like out to sea. Sometimes they're just in, lakes or whatever. So I feel like a lot of my job is spent in logistics and shipping logistics and airplane logistics and driving and boats. So there's one part that's just 100% logistics, not just what equipment you're going to use, but how you're going to get there. How are you going to get your gear there? How do you ship oxygen to Alaska? How does that work? Is it going to be there in time? So that part of the logistics. The second part of logistics is just on the ground. So what's the best time of year to go? Well, what are the weather conditions? Our biggest challenge in working on the water is wind. It doesn't matter really if it rains, and it's very rare that we're in these hurricane environments, but the biggest challenge is wind, and wind you can't control, and wind a lot of times you can't forecast. So there's kind of the logistics of managing the day-to-day operations. The last part of that logistics angle is, what's the diving like? How deep? How deep is the diving? How cold? I mentioned earlier that our office has a massive geographic region that we cover, basically the continental United States plus outer islands that the National Park Service has units in. So, I mean, that puts us in some very unique environments. Next week, I'll be in Lake Superior, which is 36, 38 degree water. That's a very different dive than a month ago. I was in the Virgin Islands, yet the imaging requirements are the same. You know, you could say it's a camera, you want to take a picture, but how you get there and how long you can stay and what types of equipment you use is tremendously diverse. So we pride ourselves here at the SRC. It's what we call ourselves, the SRC. We pride ourselves of being incredibly diverse in terms of being able to dive warm water, to be able to dive cold water, but also we're very fortunate in that we dive a very unique type of diving called closed circuit rebreathers. So on your standard scuba, someone puts on a cylinder on the back and they exhale, and all these bubbles, come up through the water. That's scuba diving. And our particular type of diving that we do most of is called closed circuit diving. So basically you exhale and your exhalations get scrubbed through a chemical medium that takes out carbon dioxide in a complicated process, and you rebreathe it. So that rebreathing allows us to be incredibly efficient and stay a lot longer underwater with less decompression obligation that is kind of a byproduct of diving at depth under pressure. So we have the tools to do a lot of longer dives to work underwater. We also have the tools to do a lot of deeper dives. So we maintain mixed gas diving that we can dive to a couple hundred feet to monitor shipwrecks or coral reefs. So the question of how do we prepare for a project is it's so nuanced with so many different angles. It's a great question because there's never one project that's the same as the last. There really isn't. And we try to train and become incredibly efficient and incredibly safe on the systems that we have because there's such diversity in the environments and the tasks that we're doing. The last thing I'll say about just the logistics is, a lot of people scuba dive and we scuba dive as well, but no one in this office would call themselves a professional diver. I'm a photographer. We have archaeologists. We have maintenance people. We have to be so efficient and so safe on our systems underwater, on our scuba gear, that it's second nature, right? So we have to train and train and train and have exposure and do workup dives, because when I'm underwater shooting, I don't really have time and don't have the capacity to monitor, to focus on just life support. And that sounds dangerous. A lot of people say, oh, well, that's crazy talk. But if you look at the diving community, a lot of what the diving community does is the dive is the task, right? So they plan their dive, they go down, they look at something and they leave. Diving for us is just getting to where we work. So the idea of being able to stay there and as safely and as long as possible is really paramount in our world. And the way we do that is through training, but it's also through this advanced diving technology with these closed circuit rebreathers and being able to manage those and manage them safely across a tremendous geological or geographic area and diverse diving of conditions.
So these closed circuit rebreathers, are they common in the recreational diving community at this point?
They're starting to be more common. There's a couple of the biggest barrier to them, quite honestly, is price. I mean, the systems that we dive are $10,000, $12,000 just per person for the unit, right? So that's a little bit more than your average kind of weekend scuba diver is gonna pay for. They are becoming more and more popular in the deep technical diving world. The people who are doing long exploration dives in caves, who are doing deep shipwreck penetrations or work there, they're popular in that, but that's a very specialized niche. Until these closed circuit rebreathers get down to the point where they're a couple $1,000s, and they will eventually as technology advances. They're not really well known and certainly not well used in a relatively small population of the America of people anyway who are scuba divers, right? There's a lot of people who say they're scuba divers, but really they go to the islands once a year, have scuba dived, so they're not super popular right now in the diving community.
So I want to hear more about photography equipment,
Yes.
and how you determine what
Yeah.
equipment to use on a dive. And,
Mhm.
I was looking at some of your photographs, and some of your rigging seems to be pretty complex. For
Yes.
example, in a couple of shots, it looks like the camera is tethered to what might be a float on the surface or the boat to support the weight of the camera and the lights and the tripod. So tell us more about the equipment.
Yeah, so equipment is ever changing. I used to, when I started in underwater photography, I'm kind of dating myself, but there was this thing that we used to call film, and film would go in a camera, and you would have 36 chances to make a photo, right? That was it. And underwater, that was limiting, right? Because you were under there. It wasn't like you could, take a roll of film, shoot a roll of film, and then just change out. You had to surface, and there was all those logistical problems. So the idea that photography has kind of been mainstay in scuba diving is kind of an understatement. I don't really know too many people that dive that don't take pictures underwater because of how the technology has advanced. In our world, we have followed those trends into digital photography and high definition and 4K video. Like all of those technical transitions have followed us as well. The thing that we've kind of pushed the envelope a little bit is on these high resolution optical systems. For instance, we were doing 3D cinematography, back when 3D movies were kind of back in vogue in 2010, 2012. We were kind of working with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We were doing visitor center films in 3D. We were kind of pushing the edge of the envelope in that. And that might have been some of those camera systems that you saw. Those were tethered to the surface with fiber optic connections. Some of the other systems that we have built and we use, we're very big now into this new world called photogrammetry. And photogrammetry really has revolutionized our ability to both document things underwater, but also to tell the story of those things underwater. Photogrammetry is a very simple process. It's basically you shooting hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of images of anything underwater or anything anywhere. It doesn't have to be underwater, just that's what we specialize in. And then we use computer software to stitch those together to create 3D representations of whatever it is. And it sounds kind of dry and boring, but where it really comes into play for us is these remote areas. If we work in the Central Pacific, where hardly anybody ever has seen some of these World War II planes or these historic shipwrecks, having the ability to really saturate a site and bring that site back in a three-dimensional world where the public can look at it online, they can manipulate it, they can zoom, all of those kinds of things. So the technology has really advanced into digital photography, and our office is really taking that digital photography and pushing it, kind of pushing the edge of the envelope all the time to figure out how we can better not only document, because that's what we do in the Park Service, and conserve and preserve, but also to tell the stories of those things underwater and bring those to the surface more so that more people can understand the amazing things in our parks.
So when you're snapping an image, are you very deliberate with how you compose the shot, or do you snap away and hope for the best, or a combination of
Yeah.
all those things?
Having the benefit of starting in the world of film really helps your eye and your technical ability, because you didn't have the ability to shoot and flail away. You didn't have a review. You didn't have an LCD screen to tell you if you got it right. You had to understand the principles of photography. You had to understand aperture versus f-stop versus shutter speed, right? You had to kind of and you had to mentally look at those things through your mind's eye, if you will, and kind of understand what the camera sees versus what you see, because those are oftentimes two very different things depending on the conditions. So transitioning over into digital photography, I find that I love having the instant feedback. I love, being able to see if my images are correct or near correct. But I will say, having that background and that kind of history in film, I can basically understand what the assignment is and have a starting point in my mind in terms of what the camera setup is supposed to be. Like I can tell you based on visibility, temperature, depth, light exposure, all that, what the starting point is. And that makes me more efficient. I don't have to go down there and be on the bottom guessing where to start the camera. And the other thing that transition has allowed is I always shoot manual, meaning I always have total control of the camera, right? So even though cameras have gotten really good and our iPhones take spectacular photographs, most of that stuff is on automatic. And underwater, sometimes that skews a little bit, and more towards the people who have these point and shoot cameras who take a lot of pictures. I'm not going to say they get lucky, but the technology kind of compensates for a lack of knowledge in the photographic world. Now, that really helps if you have a photographic eye, because that's a totally separate thing. An artistic ability to what we would say make a photograph, right? Not just take one, but make one, to frame a shot, is different from the camera's ability to capture that. So you really have to kind of blend in the world of professional photography. You have to blend an artistic appreciation in crafting a scene, if you will, and then having the technical ability of the camera to actually capture what you want. And that's the most rewarding thing, is when you see a photograph in your mind's eye and you set up the camera to take that photo and it actually reflects what you want it to. And that's the ultimate goal, right? That's the prize. That's the cherry on top, is when you're able to kind of make a photograph that you've wanted to make. And that can go in two ways. I mean, there's some projects where I go in and think of photos that will tell a great story. And that requires a little bit more setup. That requires having a diver hover for me in a specific area, versus capturing science as it's happening. How does an archaeologist who's excavating a shipwreck, how do you capture the shot when they're working? Because they're not going to stop for you. They're not going to do setups. We're not shooting for National Geographic. We don't have underwater models. We have to document science as it's happening. So that ability to be incredibly proficient with your camera, knowing the angles that are going to tell the story in real time, has also made me, I think, a little bit of a different photographer in terms of a working photographer, a documentary photographer, maybe being able to capture that image while it happens without having to set up a lot of background or spend dives having people model.
And I would think that your disciplined approach saves you from having to go through thousands of images when you get back to the surface.
It does. It helps in that. I will say, I'm not going to say that I'm a very what I would call a lean photographer, in that I shoot a lot of images, because the difference between a really good photograph and a really great photograph is all about timing. Sometimes you might shoot an image where the diver has bubbles over their face and it obscures them. Sometimes you might shoot an image where they're kind of awkward looking in the water. Their fin is weird, or their legs are kind of, I don't know, in a weird position. And you may have all of the features that you want, but you may have some of those odd things, those things that don't get visually appealing. And the way you get around that is you shoot a lot, honestly. I have no problem in the world of digital photography shooting thousands and thousands of images, because hard drive space is very inexpensive, but you'll never get back to that scene, if that makes sense. You may get back to that park or to that shipwreck, but you'll never get back to that moment where that diver is doing that thing in that environment. It doesn't happen. And to take that one step further, I've been involved in a lot of projects where the project directors don't know if they're going to get another opportunity. I mean, I've worked in the Canadian Arctic, where every day we were one day away from the ice floes coming in and diving under the ice and the whole project being scrubbed. So they would send me in to make sure they got the shot. Or diving on World War II planes that were recently discovered. They weren't sure if we were going to be able to get back. So get the photographer in, get the shot, tell the story. So you have to have a really great understanding of the equipment, but not be willing. There's a lot of photographers today who are really talented in what they do because they have a lot of support and people working with them. I know a lot of photographers that make incredible images that require a lot of people to light for them, that require a lot of people to model for them, requires a lot of setup. And these are reflected largely in the popular magazines and Geographic or other magazines. That's a very different type of photography than what I do. Is you got to capture it in the moment, and you got to walk away and be able to tell the story, because the science or the project requires that of you. And that's the job. It's to come back with the image, because that's why I'm in the water, and that's why the Park Service has invested in me to tell those stories for us.
Do you ever use Photoshop to alter any of the images?
I do. So I use Adobe. I use Lightroom. So Adobe Lightroom is really the backbone architecture of all of our imaging, because that particular project is that software, I should say, When you shoot thousands of photos, and a lot of times in the photogrammetry aspect of our world, I will go down and I'll shoot 20,000 photos in a dive, a single dive. And you have to have some place to catalog those, to inventory those, to manage those. So there's an archival aspect to imaging these days as well. I mean, it's always been a struggle in underwater photography. How do you catalog your images? How do you find your images? You know, it's different when you're, you know, taking your kids on vacation. You remember, oh, I think that was, you know, 3 years ago in Florida. When you're doing this regularly and you're generating the volume and the data that you have to be able to have a workflow to manage that. I use Adobe Lightroom, and yes, I do edit my photos. Nowadays, it's an interesting thing of how much software and processing can, quote, save a photographer, right? I mean, we won't even get into AI and what AI can do, and what you know, you can basically make up these scenes that look great. But in photography, it is that kind of ethical question of how much do you alter your image? How much do you make something look better? And that can go either from clarity of water or color or warmth of water, all the way to cloning dead coral or cloning live coral, or, you know, shaping the story because of these software technologies that we have. So you really have to kind of have I think you have to have a strong ethical kind of case behind you that this is the story. It's not what I think the story should be. It's what the story is. Just as one example. So there's parks that we work in now that I've been shooting in for 25 years. We've seen a lot of change in 25 years in our oceans, and it's not good. We've seen a lot of coral decline. So I have catalogs of parks, like say in South Florida, the Virgin Islands, of really robust reef structures, coral reefs, you know, beautiful images of divers and visitors on reefs that I don't use anymore. I simply don't send them out to publications or web because it's not actually telling the story. It's not a truthful representation of that park as it is today. And I think the same can be said with software. You really have to be careful of documenting what's there, but not embellishing what's there and making it look better. And software can play a big part of that. My basic philosophy is software helps me make the image better in terms of, you know, in terms of color balance, you know, because what I think of is we are limited in what we can capture underwater. We're working under a totally different parameter. We're shooting through a medium. We don't have the light available to us. There's things in the air, the water column. Those are the things that I look to correct or remediate underwater, not reestablishing scenes or, you know, putting things in that aren't there, those types of things. And that's where software comes into play for me personally.
Well, going back to equipment, when I spoke to Dave a few years ago, he told the story about how you brought in some borrowed Hollywood lighting to photograph the B-29 bomber at the bottom of Lake Mead. So tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, one of the more interesting things about my career is I'm good friends with a lot of people in the underwater industry, because I'm good friends with them because I'm not competing with them. I have a job. I'm not going after magazine stories or whatever. So I've fostered a lot of friends in the underwater world. And one very good friend of mine has a company in LA who does all major Hollywood movie stuff underwater. He's a very talented underwater photographer and cinematographer. So we were diving this B-29. We were setting up these dives on a B-29. It was almost 200 feet deep in Lake Mead National Recreation Area outside of Las Vegas. Very dark at that depth, just because there's virtually no light penetration. And for me as an imager, I've never really been that interested in super deep wrecks because there's no light. I mean, photography is all about light. Either you bring the light or you capture the light that's available to you. On this particular dive, I was interested both in the diver safety, having ability to see a large context, but also selfishly, I was interested in the imaging as well. So we designed, it's not a very novel concept, but we designed this big chandelier of these massive Hollywood lights, and we dangled them off of our dive barge over this B-29 super fortress that crashed in 1948. And I was fortunate enough to do the first dive on that particular plane after we were working on it at our team. And I'll never forget going down and, you know, having a predetermined time in which the lights would come on, and it went from total blackness to all of a sudden someone had just turned on the sun, And laid out before us was this aluminum skin of this World War II bomber just sitting on the bottom of Lake Mead at 200 feet. It was a sight that I'll never get out of my mind's eye. It was spectacular. But using technology like that, and it aided me in photography in that I now had a light source that we could document, but also aided the archaeologists in the mapping. They didn't have to focus on these small areas only contingent on their flashlight, but the whole site was illuminated. So that was a pretty good use of kind of an external partnership of knowing people in the industry. And the other thing that I've benefited from in my careers is honestly, everybody loves the National Park Service. And the National Park Service is one of the few federal agencies that consistently gets high marks in terms of visitor experience and kind of, I don't know, just kind of public sentiment towards, right? So there's nothing wrong with kind of utilizing that and saying, hey, I'm with the National Park Service. We don't have huge Hollywood budgets, but we have this really interesting project. Would you like to help out? And we've gotten such tremendous support from camera people, from manufacturers. Not to say that we don't pay for anything, we certainly do, but I mean, just that kind of in-kind kind of help, and everybody kind of wants to get on board for a great project for conservation or preservation, and having the National Park Service kind of arrowhead on those projects really opens up some tremendous doors for us to be able to work underwater.
Well, I want to ask you about some of your other images in the parks. The first one I saw, a picture that I wanted to ask you about, Ellis Island National Monument. There's some kind of shallow shipwreck or ship hull really close to one of the piers. What was that all about?
Yeah, so that was an interesting story. It was several years ago now, but Ellis Island and Statue of Liberty, they actually had an issue, which is what we deal with a lot of. Parks have an issue they need help fixing, whatever that is: dock clearances, removal of things, mapping, finding. And at Ellis Island in particular, the Ellis Island ferry had sunk in the slip. And when we were working there, we were told about a third of the United States population could trace their ancestry to that ferry, because Ellis Island was the largest concentration of immigration station for the United States. So it was an incredibly historic ferry. So the park just couldn't rip it out, right? You can't just pull it out for the sake of convenience. And really, the concession, the people who run those ships back and forth for the public, the companies that do that, they wanted the slip space, but there's this historic hull in the way. So our office was asked to go in and do clearance and basically look at what was remaining and look to see if anything was worth recovering to help tell that story. So by the time we got there, most of the ship was not worth recovering. It was all dilapidated and really was not structurally sound. But we did identify a few things: the brass propellers, for instance, a couple of key diagnostic features like engineering and engine parts that we were able to recover. And we basically made recommendations to the park. This is worth saving because this can be conserved and can help tell the story of this Ellis Island ferry. And this is really just too far gone. It's not worth saving. We would recommend removal. So we spent a couple months there diving in very shallow water. I'm going to say not very clean water at all in New York Harbor. It was some of the grossest, to be perfectly blunt, diving we've ever done. And that offered up a little bit of a unique experience for contaminated diving with full face masks and dry suits and gloves. And we were very specific about the type of diving that we did. And in fact, that project reminds me of just one thing about that project, since you brought it up. I don't know if you've ever, well, I'm sure you've seen the movie Star Wars. And in Star Wars, there's this scene where they're in this trash compactor and there's just detritus floating all over the place and they're trying to figure out.
I remember that.
Yeah, so there we were on the dock at Ellis Island getting ready to jump in the water, and we looked in the water and I swear it looked exactly like the scene out of Star Wars. There was styrofoam and cups and plastic, and there was just the whole surface was covered with trash. So we would all gear up, we would all get ready, all 100% ready. We'd all sit side by side on the dock, and then all in unison, we'd take our fins and we'd create this kind of moon pool, like this clear water path where there was no detritus in our way. And we'd all like quick jump off and stay underwater for the entire dive. So we didn't have to like swim around in that kind of floating debris. So it wasn't exactly the nicest place, the nicest project and environment we've ever dove in, but the park had a need. And there's a lot of those types of diving. For every one Virgin Islands or, Caribbean reef dive we do, there's one or two these blackwater reservoir clearance or New York Harbor type dives that no one at a party would say, man, I'm so jealous that you're an underwater photographer, because they're really difficult and they're really not much fun.
So another photo from Olympic National Park,
Yes.
some old submerged car. What's the story behind it?
Yes. Oh, one of my favorites. I don't know how you found these. It's like we talked about this, but we didn't. These are some of my favorite like things underwater. The Warren car. Oh, there's a whole podcast on that. The short story is Russell and Blanche Warren were in Port Angeles, Washington, and they were there in 1948, I think it was. I want to say 48. I'm not sure if the date, but anyway, they were in Port Angeles and they bought a washer and dryer, and they had this Chevy, and they couldn't fit both their twin boys and the washing machine in the car, so they left their boys in Port Angeles, Washington, and to take the ferry back, they lived in the woods or in the rural area away from the city, and they disappeared. They never were seen again. And then a really fascinating law enforcement ranger in the like late 90s heard about this, and there was always this theory that the car went off the road and went into the lake, but no one had ever found anything. So during dive trainings, he started diving deeper and deeper, and just in the area, trying to look for any kind of debris that might indicate something was there. And then he and some other people stumbled on this old washing machine, and the washing machine lid dated from the time period of Russell and Blanche Warren. So he kept diving deeper and deeper. We were asked to go in. Eventually, that car was found at 170 feet deep. So we were asked to come in and document the car. And then we were subsequently asked to come in and recover some human remains that were discovered near the car, and to excavate those remains, send them off to Quantico for DNA testing. And it was confirmed that Russell Warren, the husband, his remains were recovered, and we never really found out anything about Blanche. We never found any material record of Blanche. But it's kind of a cold case, and it's one of these fascinating things that a few people kind of started pulling on the strings of history, and the material record, the archaeology of it or the anthropology of it, actually kind of started to reveal itself. And it was because our office, the National Park Service, has the capability of these highly trained and highly specialized divers that we were able to work at 170 to 190 feet, document the car, recover the remains, and then give closure to the family whose parents had just honestly vanished one random Saturday, bringing home a washing machine. So that's a pretty interesting case. I mean, it's not, it doesn't solve world history or have this huge geopolitical story to it, but it's a really fascinating story, and it did have incredible significance to the Warren family, and it gave them tremendous closure, who still live locally in the Port Angeles, Washington area. It gave them tremendous closure as to what happened to their parents, and kind of closed that portion of their family's history, which was a really interesting project to be involved in.
So the Chevy, was it a 1948 model? And because
It
it's
was.
so remarkably well preserved, the
Yes.
tires are still intact.
Yes. It was the Chevy at the time, I think, was a year old, but yes, I believe it was from the late 40s. I may be getting that wrong, and there are probably people who are going to email me and say how horrible I am at dates, but I believe it was in that time period. Yeah, because that water in Crescent Lake is cold. It's fresh water. And it's very low oxygen. So there's very little growing. There's very little life. There's very little things that would deteriorate it. So it has a remarkable rate of preservation. And we see that in places all over the world, quite frankly. I mean, most people think out of sight, out of mind, doesn't matter. It's all going away. We gotta pull it up, and, we got to salvage it as quick as possible. But actually, things underwater last a long time. And we've done a lot of projects, Crescent Lake with that 19, you know what? I'm gonna re-edit history here. It wasn't in the 40s. It was 1927. It was a 1927 Chevy. So it was the late 20s that Chevy was there. But we see this in World War II sites in Pearl Harbor in the USS Arizona. We see it in Greek, 2,000-year-old Greek shipwrecks. Underwater has a tremendous way of preserving things, and that's one of the fascinating things. You can, every now and then you come across these touchstones that tell history, and the history is still there, laying underwater, which is a fascinating aspect of my job as well.
Well, speaking of preservation of shipwrecks and other objects under the water, at Isle Royale National Park, There's so many shipwrecks. It almost seems like, did any ship ever stay afloat in Lake Superior?
Yeah.
So that's surely, and you mentioned you're going to go there
Mhm.
next week, Lake Superior. Surely that's got to be one of your favorite places to dive.
It is. It for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of traces. It's like I had someone tell me once, if someone had planned an underwater shipwreck museum, you couldn't do any better than Isle Royal, because you trace the lineage from sail to steam to these bulk freighters. So all the way from sailing vessels in the late 1800s, all the way through the early 19 to mid 1900s with these bulk freighters carrying cargo. So that's one thing that makes it unique, is this kind of time stamp and this collection, if you will, of seeing maritime engineering evolve from sails and these big sailing ships to these massive boilers and steam engines. The other thing that makes Isle Royal incredibly unique is it's the last foothold of underwater space in the Great Lakes that has not been kind of invaded by invasive species. So the rest of Lake Superior and the southern Lake Superior has zebra mussels, and they've carpeted everything. So everything that's underwater, docks and shipwrecks and anything that's there has this scab, this carpeting of mussels. At Isle Royal, you don't have that. You have this kind of clean looking shipwreck. So when you're diving on these shipwrecks and you're looking at these machines and these windlasses and these boilers, and you can see all the nuts and the bolts, and you can see the worm gears, like all of the intricacies of this engineering marvels, you actually get to see. And because it's freshwater and because it's so cold, the rate of preservation is remarkable. Wooden ships, steel ships, you still, some of them you look at, and despite their damage, if they hit a reef, is usually what happened at Isle Royal. They ran aground and had some sort of structural problem that made them sink. Aside from that aspect of the shipwreck, it looks like you could refloat them and they would work. It looks like you could fire up some of the boilers and they would work. So it's a really remarkable place to see preserved shipwrecks. I think it's by far the best collection of shipwrecks anywhere in the United States. If you really want to look at, again, this kind of theme of shipwreck history. But the diving is difficult. It's not kind of for general consumption, and that it's cold. And even in the warmest of summer, you get Superior will heat up a little bit, but it's only like the first foot that gets warm. Once you get below 60 feet, or certainly down to some of the depths that we work at 160 feet, it's dark and it's cold, and it's a very unforgiving space. So it requires a certain type of diver, an advanced diver. It requires some concentration on medical evacuation and all of the things, the emergency planning that we do. But it is a spectacular group of a collection of shipwrecks, and one that we've been working over the past few years to tell that story in a very new and innovative way. Again, using this 3D photogrammetry to bring these shipwrecks to life, where people can look at them, they can examine them, they can kind of zoom in and see all of the the tools that are on the deck, or the ladders, or all of these little idiosyncrasies that a lot of times hand mapping and underwater archaeology can't quite document. This photogrammetric documentation, this digital clone, if you will, of what's underwater, really is a compelling way to tell the stories.
So I wanted to ask you about the cold.
Yeah.
I'm sure you wear specialty dry suits and equipment
Mm-hmm.
and all
Mm-hmm.
that. As a former PADI diver myself, I could tell you that after about 30 minutes in 80-degree water, you get cold. So
Absolutely.
when you're diving these 30, some degree waters, how long does it take for you to feel the coldness? And
Right.
like, do you start to shiver, or what's the warning sign for you when you feel like, okay, even though I have enough, oxygen in the tank or in the,
Yes.
rebreather,
Yeah.
when do you know, uh-oh, I better head to
Yeah.
the surface?
Well, it's a great question, because a lot of times when you're working underwater, you get task fixated, and it takes so much time and energy to get there, and so much logistics, and the weather's got to be just right, and all of these things have to line up, and then you finally get in the water. The last thing you want to do is leave because you're cold or because you're inconvenienced. But you have to be very careful about that, because in Isle Royal, in the cold water environment, it's not just inconvenience, it's life threatening, right? I will say, because we do what we do, we are very blessed and very fortunate to have very, very good equipment. I mean, those of us who manage the Park Service program here at the Submerged Resources Center have fought very hard to say that, look, this is what we do professionally. We are some of the best of anybody in the world doing this. We need to have the gear that reflects that, and not because it's a pride thing, because it's a safety thing. So in cold water, like you mentioned, yes, absolutely, dry suits, 100%. None of us would dive wet there. Dry suits, and then to take it one step further, we dive heated gear, meaning under our dry suits we have thermal protection, thick thermal protection. But nowadays we use thermal protection that has heat in it, so it has heating membranes. So you can turn on a battery source and you can get heat to certain parts of your body. Even in your hands, your gloves can be heated as well. So that kind of staves off the cold. But I will say that when you're diving in that type of environment, regardless of the task, there's certain parts of your body that are exposed, mainly your face, your lips, and it becomes unbearable after. We generally can do about 2 hours with all of the thermal equipment that we have. 2 hours, I found, is basically an operational limit, to where eventually your hands start to get numb. You can't feel your face at all. Like, you can't feel your lips or any of that kind of stuff. And then it just becomes inconvenient. And then more than the inconvenience, your mind actually starts to slow down and you start to care less. You become a little bit lethargic. And it's part of a tiring process, but also kind of thermal, depletion process, where you really have to monitor what you're doing and how long you should stay in these environments. The other thing we have in our world is it's not debatable. If one person is unsafe, inconvenienced, not sure of the dive, we call the dive, right? So no matter how much I'm working, how important the imaging is to me, if my buddy has an issue, or my buddy is cold, or my buddy whatever, we have a very high respect for each other, that we know that when the dive is called, the dive is called. There's no negotiating on the bottom. Well, can we stay for 5 more minutes? And it's basically, okay, you want to go? Okay, let's fold up the camera, let's pack everything up, and let's, we'll head to the surface. But cold dive, I love to dive cold. I love it. I do probably 70% of my dives are all in dry suits, because I don't, it sounds weird, but I don't really like getting wet when I scuba dive. I know that's kind of a weird thing, but I love diving dry. And cold water, I love even more. I just love having the ability to be in a dry suit and be able to control my thermal. And I think there's more things to see in the cold water. I find that that's the case in my experience around the world. There's been some fascinating things in cold water that you don't find anywhere else. And I appreciate that. Generally in those type of conditions too, I found it's very beneficial to do one long dive a day, right? So rather than trying to do a lot of shorter repetitive dives where you might get, you might kind of stay ahead of being cold, I find it's a lot more, you get a lot more work done is if you plan to be cold, but you basically do one dive, and you kind of maximize your work in that time frame. And that again comes into play with having the right thermal protection in those dry suits, but also having closed circuit rebreathers. There's a byproduct in the rebreather diving that allows us to kind of combat cold water diving, in that it's a weird chemical exchange. But what happens when we exhale on the rebreathers, the carbon dioxide has this chemical reaction that creates heat, and that heat basically warms up the air we're breathing. So basically, and it creates moisture. So when we're diving on closed circuit rebreathers in cold water, rather than being on a scuba cylinder where it's at ambient temperature, where it's super cold, dry air, on a rebreather, we're diving warm, moist air. And that internally keeps you warmer thermally, from your core standpoint. It's a lot more efficient than diving scuba. So all of those things kind of stacked on top of each other, doing this, kind of occupationally, allow us to stay in the water a little bit longer probably than the normal diver would in those cold environments.
I mentioned a couple of different shipwrecks or submerged cars and that kind of thing. Are there any other ones that just kind of jump out to you that you'd like to tell me about?
The shipwreck probably that I've had the closest personal, it sounds kind of strange, but personal connection with is the USS Arizona in Pearl Harbor. I started diving the USS Arizona in the mid 1990s as a young kid. It's a site that's closed to all diving. I have done, I don't know how many films for, History, Geographic, Discovery, all of the media partners and articles. Because it's closed to diving, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of filming and a lot of work for outside agencies and outside partners. But I've also had the opportunity to do a lot of work for the Park Service. And the USS Arizona is a site that it's such a sacred site. There's still 1,000 sailors and Marines that are entombed in that site. We treat it with utmost respect. There's the kind of two-edged sword. There's the access that I'm afforded working for the Park Service that is allowed to dive on the site, but there's really the kind of responsibility, and I think really the kind of commitment to tell the story in Pearl Harbor for those who time fades stories, right? I mean, I think in the 1940s and the 1950s, Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, was a much different event than it is 82 years later, right? I mean, we forget things that generationally we weren't part of. And I feel that it's my responsibility as a photographer to keep those stories alive. And whether that's befriending USS Arizona survivors, of which there are, the last one died just a couple of weeks ago, Lauren, telling their stories. And it really kind of moved me to spend a career, quite frankly, 30 years of diving on that site, trying to communicate the importance, the significance, and the loss of life of that site, and the stories behind just the ship. It's not just a steel and wooden ship. It has a soul. It has, people interred in it. I wrote a book actually called Beneath Pearl Harbor. It's a coffee table photo book. And the only reason I did that was nothing to do with, money. I don't make anything off it. I did it as part of a Park Service project. But I really wanted people to understand that this is a touchstone. The Park Service is really good at remembering and honoring. And we create these amazing, battlefield monuments and these, grand marble statues and commemorate history. The thing about Pearl Harbor is it's still there. I mean, yes, there's a glistening white memorial over the battleship, but the battleship is still there. I always say it'd be like going to Gettysburg. And if the trenches were still there and the guns were still laid out and, there was still cannons there, that's what it's like on the Arizona. There's still shoes on the deck. There's still bottles. There's still forks and spoons, things that the sailors were using on December 7th when that attack happened. So it's a site that has a real deep personal connection to me. I never served in the military. I don't have that connection, but I do have the connection of being allowed access and wanting to share that access with as many people as I possibly can. And really the reason to share that access is this still matters. This is still an important part of our nation's history. It's not something we put a memorial on and engrave people's names in. There's still a physical touchstone there. So that's the kind of educational aspect. From a resource management, we're asked all the time, what's going on with the ship, right? So my photography has been involved with oil collection and all types of scientific research on the ship. And that's kind of been the more generic science-based thing. But I would say the USS Arizona ship that I probably have I've dove the USS Arizona more than any other site in my career. And probably, well, not probably, more than anyone else ever has dove it in history. So I have a real deep connection to the site. And I feel that it's kind of my responsibility as the person who has access to tell those stories. And I've tried it my whole career. I've tried to figure out ways to showcase and to help people connect with that site. And it's been a career passion, but it's also been kind of a career goal, is to always come up with new and interesting ways to tell that story. So it's kind of a long-winded answer. I apologize, but I would have to say absolutely the USS Arizona, because of its uniqueness and my access and the stories that are there that really deserve to be told.
Yeah, no apology necessary. It's a very interesting story. And you mentioned that you first dove there when you were a young man. And I was curious to know when you got started in diving and how you found your way to the Park Service.
Yeah. It's a long and winding road, which I'm sure nobody else cares about but me. I will say that it was a series of fortunate events, but more than that, it was a lot of work. I went to film school. While I was in film school, I was researching a project. I always was in love with the ocean. I grew up near the coast of New England, near the coast. Had an uncle that was a lobsterman. Always saw what came up off the bottom. Always wanted to go there firsthand. I had a subscription to Skin Diver magazine when I was 8 years old. I didn't know how to dive. I didn't know what it was all about. I spent my summers at a lake trying to build contraptions that I could stay underwater. We tried bicycle pumps. We tried long garden hoses, 5-gallon buckets, you name it. I was always trying to stay underwater. So I went to film school. Out of film school, I was researching a film project, got connected with the National Park Service, volunteered one for a summer through a series of events, and then never looked back. I hung around long enough, so I'd like to think that I showed a certain amount of talent that they eventually hired me, but it might have been I just wore them down, because for 7 years, I didn't go away. I worked contracts, I worked seasonal appointments, I labeled slides for years and years. I did anything they asked me to do, just to stay involved in this amazing office that is the Submerged Resources Center, and eventually was able to get a permanent position. And with that permanent position, I kind of made it my career goal, both to do the best work I could do, but also foster as many people as I could foster. I worked under an individual who wasn't very forthcoming with knowledge and expertise and kind of fostering the next generation, if you will. So one of my kind of sideline goals or kind of, things that is still very prevalent to me is anything that I know, passing it on to someone else, right? And that career that I've been afforded in the National Park Service help, foster the next generation of shooters and help them. What does it mean to be an underwater photographer in this digital world? What does it mean to be able to shape stories on Insta? How do you get the information out there in a digital medium that's so crowded and so full? How do you get your story told? Working with individuals like that and trying to share that. So I'm an anomaly in the National Park Service in that I went to film school, I got a job with a program, and I've stayed here for 30 years. Most Park Service employees, they jump around to parks, they get higher grade, they get different experiences, it's a very transitory employee workforce. I've just stayed because it's always been a passion of mine.
So you're off to Isle Royale and Wrangell St. Elias next
Yes.
week, or the
Yes.
next couple of weeks. What's
Yes.
happening in those places?
So Isle Royale, we're continuing the kind of digital mapping of these shipwrecks. We're working on a large scale project that the Submerged Resources Center in the 1980s, or the original archaeologists who mapped all of these shipwrecks. So these line drawings, and they put together a book, really incredible maps. Our goal is to kind of revamp those, bring those into the 21st century with digital visualizations of those, creating these story maps, these web-based contents that basically allows the visitor to come and explore these wrecks, hear the stories, talk about those, experience them as best as you can experience them without being underwater. So that's Isle Royale. We've been working on that project for a couple of years. We're coming to an end now and starting to build out the web-based component. Alaska is kind of a weird project, and it's kind of what we do in that we have these things come through the door. They reached out to us. There's a series of scientific instrumentation that are in a glacial lake that they put out to monitor dissolved oxygen, temperature, and the melting of the glaciers from an environmental standpoint. They put these sondes out, these environmental loggers out a couple years ago, and they haven't been able to retrieve them. So the last ditch effort is to go up and actually put divers in the water. It's incredibly cold. It's a glacial lake, probably zero visibility. Some of the loggers are, some of the loggers are 300 feet deep, but we're not going there. We'll probably do a couple 100 feet to recover them.
Bret, thank you so much for your time today. This has just been fascinating, and I've really enjoyed talking to you and learning about the kinds of things that you do and the kinds of images you capture.
Well, thank you very much. It always feels a little bit strange for a photographer to talk to somebody about their images. I love giving presentations, and showcasing work, showcasing those stories. I feel it's a little bit dry just to hear me talk about them. So I appreciate the feedback. I hope I wasn't too long-winded, and I hope I was able to kind of give a little bit of a glimpse of what the Park Service does and why we have someone who has this kind of crazy job to shoot underwater to showcase this kind of world that most of the people don't know exists in the Park Service. And I will say that for any other things that come up, because we're the Park Service, we're always here to help kind of a thing. People can reach out to me on email or with questions or any follow-up and those types of things. We're always trying to engage and to educate. So any one of those venues is great to connect with people. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of tell my story and my deal. And I hope it was beneficial for you.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. To learn more about the projects and photography of the Submerged Resources Center, go to nps.gov/submerged. You can also view images taken by Bret for the National Park Service at bretseymourphotography.com. For those who would like to listen to Lynn's interview with Submerged Resources Center Chief Dave Conlon and hear more about the unique work of the center, that's podcast episode 116. Next week, we'll be talking about wildlife and the role national parks serve in providing and protecting habitat crucial for their survival. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.